What would you do? If, at 35,000 feet in the air, a black teenager was slapped right in front of you? No one had time to react. No one had time to speak. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. Every laugh, every whisper in cabin Delta 1874 vanished, swallowed by a thick silence that hit harder than the slap itself. Elijah Bennett, 16 years old, snapped his head to the side. His cheek blazed red, not just from the impact, but from the shame burning beneath his skin. He didn't understand what had just happened. Why? Across from him, a silver-haired man in a crisp suit, Thomas Whitaker, stood, still pointing his finger in Elijah's face, chest heaving with rage. "I told you, kid, know your place and sit still." The words didn't just cut through the cabin air, they tore through dignity. They carried the stench of racism too familiar to history. But now they rang out in a pressurized cabin, surrounded by cameras and smartphones, making them even more terrifying. Heads turned, phones were raised. A flight attendant rushed over, still too far to stop it. 3 seconds. 4. 5. No one moved, no one dared speak. The plane had become a stage, one where everyone knew they were witnessing something wrong, chosen to do the right thing. Until one man stood up. An older man, salt and pepper hair, average build, 60-something. No one had noticed him before. He didn't yell, he didn't make a scene, he just stood up, row 26. And in a voice not loud but deep and steady, he said, "No, not this time." His name was Daniel Kovac, a retired veteran, a man who had once served in Iraq, a man who had once stayed silent when injustice unfolded around him and regretted it for half his life. But this time, he would not sit still. "Sir, please remain seated," the flight attendant shouted. Daniel replied, "I can't, not this time." Was the moment everything changed. One man stood. A cabin full of passengers froze, and a chain of events was about to unfold, events no one could have predicted. But to understand why Daniel Kovac risked everything for a boy he had never met, we have to go back. 6 hours earlier, at Gate 19 of JFK International. As boarding began, Elijah lined up in Group 3. In front of him stood a middle-aged man in a sharp navy suit, thin-rimmed glasses, and polished leather shoes, undeniably business-class material. As Elijah adjusted his backpack strap, he accidentally brushed the man's arm. The man snapped around, eyes like steel. "Watch where you're going, kid," he muttered. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably laced with disdain. Elijah recoiled slightly, murmuring, "Sorry, sir." That man was Thomas Whitaker, vice president of a major investment firm in New York. A man used to power, to deference. But one thing he wasn't used to was seeing a black teenager walk beside him like an equal. Elijah's seat was 19B, middle seat. On his left was Skylar, the girl he didn't think would even remember him. On his right, Thomas Whitaker. 3 people, 1 row, 1 flight, and a fuse already lit, just waiting for the spark. Back in 26F, Daniel Kovac watched the boy as he entered the plane. Something about Elijah struck him, his posture, his eyes, the way he carried himself. It was like looking at a reflection of someone from long ago. James Henderson, the black soldier who had once taken a bullet for Daniel in Baghdad, the man who saved his life and to whom Daniel owed everything. A debt he never got to repay. As the plane lifted off, Elijah tried to refocus on his presentation notes. But Whitaker kept sighing, shifting, bumping elbows, tapping aggressively on the tray table. "Didn't anyone teach you manners?" he grumbled, just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah stayed quiet, part fear, part exhaustion from how familiar this kind of moment was. Skylar tried to lighten the mood. "So, what's your topic?" Elijah replied softly. "Gravitational waves from binary black hole collisions." Skylar raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed. But before she could compliment him, Whitaker scoffed. "Kids today are smart, sure, but talent doesn't replace character." Skylar turned, ready to speak up, but Elijah shook his head. "It's fine," he whispered, but inside something burned. He'd heard it 1,000 times. "You're smart, but know your place." 40 minutes later, the cabin dimmed. Passengers drifted into sleep, but row 19, it sat heavy like concrete. Elijah simply adjusted his headphones. His elbow lightly touched Whitaker's sleeve. That's all it took. Thomas Whitaker shot up. "I warned you, punk. Stay in your damn space." And then the slap. Under the dim cabin lights, Daniel Kovac opened his eyes, the sound ripping through his memory like shrapnel. He inhaled deeply. Today, he wouldn't stay silent. Because this wasn't just about Elijah Bennett. This was about every James Henderson, every man who had been slapped, shoved, or dismissed because of their skin. And like Daniel had said before, not this time. Elijah pressed himself into seat 19B, shrinking like his very existence was an inconvenience. To his right, Skylar sat still, calm in appearance but with fire in her eyes. To his left, the man who had just told him not to take up space, Whitaker, was scrolling through spreadsheets on his tablet, mumbling about stocks and important work no one had asked about. Elijah adjusted his seatbelt quietly. That small act made Whitaker glare again. Careful with that. Spill my coffee and you're out of this plane. One more mistake and the flight attendant will have you removed. Elijah clenched his jaw. He knew this type, men who believed they were moral authorities, disguising their prejudice in polite cruelty. But today it felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the pressure of the upcoming competition. Maybe it was how openly Thomas broadcasted his disdain. Or maybe it was the crushing reality of being a 16-year-old black boy forced to navigate a world never meant for him. Skylar suddenly touched his elbow. "Ignore him," she whispered. "Don't shrink yourself for people like that." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were blazing. Elijah nodded slightly, grateful. They weren't friends, had only reconnected less than an hour ago, but in that moment, he felt something unspoken between them. A thread, a shared understanding of what it meant to live under the weight of judgment. A moment later, a flight attendant named Aisha came by with the refreshment cart. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked Elijah, her glance brief but assessing. "Just water," he replied. Turning to Whitaker, she asked, "More coffee, sir?" He didn't even look up, just pointed and barked. "Black, extra strong." Aisha said nothing, but as she turned, Elijah noticed her lips tighten. She felt it too. An hour had passed, but to Elijah, each minute felt like an hour. He opened his tablet again, trying to review his presentation on space-time curvature in binary star systems. 6 months of preparation, all for a shot at MIT. But now, his mind kept circling Whitaker's words, his glares, and that constant feeling of being watched. Anxiety began to bloom in his chest like wildfire. Skylar noticed. "You okay?" she whispered. Elijah nodded. Lied, just a little tired. But she wasn't convinced. "Listen," she said gently. "I've been through what you're feeling. People like him. They try to control space, control energy. But if you let them control your mind, they win." Elijah didn't speak. Not because he didn't believe her, but because all he wanted in that moment was to cry. From the back row, Daniel Kovac watched silently. He couldn't hear every word, but he read every gesture, every flinch. He recognized that look, bracing, surviving, shrinking under weight that didn't belong to you. It took him back to Vietnam, 1975. To a black soldier who shielded him with his own body, only to be betrayed by the country he defended. That burden never left Daniel. And now, finally, perhaps the moment to make it right, had arrived. A soft ding rang overhead. The plane began to tremble gently from turbulence. Some passengers flinched, some refastened their seatbelts, others closed their eyes in silent prayers. Elijah gripped the armrest, not out of fear of the turbulence, but because of the deeper fear of being trapped. He glanced at Skylar beside him. She smiled gently, her hand brushing his. "Just clouds," she whispered. "You're okay." But Thomas was not so calm. "Just another reason why kids shouldn't be allowed on planes," he muttered, throwing a sharp look at Elijah. "Can't sit still, can't fly right." Skylar turned sharply, her voice clear for the first time. "Can you stop with the insinuations? He's done nothing wrong." Elijah quickly tugged her arm. "Don't," he whispered. "It's not worth it." But it was too late. Thomas leaned in on his elbow, angling toward Elijah. "You don't see that I'm being disturbed? No one taught you basic manners on a plane?" Elijah could feel the heat rising, anger swelling in his chest. But he swallowed it down. "I'm not disturbing you. I'm just sitting in my seat." "Oh, really?" Thomas raised an eyebrow, his smirk bitter. "Maybe we should redefine what sitting still means." The air in the cabin suddenly grew heavy, like the pressure had dropped. A few nearby passengers looked over. An older woman shook her head. A young man in the opposite row took off his headphones. Everyone was waiting, watching, bracing. And then, at that very moment, Daniel stood up. The cabin of Flight 1789 fell into a tense silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the silence of people watching, whispering, avoiding eye contact like blades in the air. Elijah sat wedged between two worlds. On one side, Skylar, trying to look composed, but her eyes showed fear. On the other, Thomas Whitaker, wealthy, polished, sipping his second bourbon, his body tense like a coiled spring. Elijah stared at his tablet, trying to review his presentation on the limits of cosmic perception in curved spacetime, a topic that felt galaxies away from the immediate reality pressing in on him. Every time he tried to focus, Thomas would sigh, just a little louder than needed, just enough to send a message. No one said anything, but every motion in that row had weight. Unspoken declarations hung in the air. Then came the first escalation. Flight attendant Amara returned with the drink cart, smiling warmly. "Anyone want anything else?" Thomas looked up. "One more. Bourbon, same as before." Amara paused, her eyes flicking between Elijah, Skylar, and back to Thomas. "I'm afraid you've reached the hourly drink limit, sir. I can offer you water or coffee instead." A polite refusal. Firm, measured, professional. Thomas straightened, his eyes cutting cold. "Are you implying something? Am I being disruptive?" His voice carried 3 rows forward. Amara held her composure. "Not at all, sir. The policy applies equally to ensure flight safety." She turned and walked away, leaving behind a tension that smelled like smoke. The message was clear. Peace in the sky doesn't always mean justice in the air. When privilege is challenged, even over something as trivial as a drink, it reacts. Another sigh. This one exaggerated. Thomas began monologuing. Not directly, but just loud enough. "Back in my day, people earned everything through hard work. No need for special programs or equality policies, just discipline." Elijah didn't answer, but the back of his neck flushed with heat. He'd heard it before. At school, during scholarship interviews, in AP classrooms. It always sounded the same. "Work hard like we did, and maybe we'll let you stay." Skylar couldn't hold back anymore. "Maybe you didn't need those programs because every door was already open for you." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like glass. "Maybe you never had to prove you were worthy of being here." Thomas turned, eyes icy. "I wasn't handed anything. I worked since I was 16. My dad was a mechanic. My mom waited tables. I climbed from the bottom." Skylar didn't flinch. "But no one ever looked at you and saw a threat. No one ever questioned whether you belonged in your seat." Elijah clenched his fists, eyes locked forward, emotions storming inside. Not because Skylar was wrong, but because she was saying what he wanted to say, but couldn't. And because she was white, people might actually hear it. Then came the breaking point. Thomas suddenly asked, "What do your parents do?" The question seemed simple, but it reeked of evaluation, of testing, of judgment. Elijah looked up, straight into his eyes. "My dad is a software engineer. My mom teaches astrophysics." Firm, no hesitation. Thomas nodded slowly, his tone smug. "Well, that explains it. You've got a foundation." And then, the dagger. "You're an exception, not the rule." That was it. The meaning of this moment laid bare. Success stories like Elijah's are often treated like miracles, not as earned. They're not allowed to be ordinary. They must be exceptional. And that perception means they never truly belong. At that moment, Daniel Kovac, 66-year-old war veteran, quietly pressed the flight attendant call button. When Amara approached, he spoke softly. "There's a situation in row 17. I think it needs closer attention." She nodded without asking questions. Daniel didn't need to explain. He had seen enough. The plane was still flying above the clouds, but inside the pressurized steel cabin, a different kind of storm was building. A quiet war of words, cloaked in civility, but soaked in prejudice, blame, and fear. Elijah turned to Skylar and whispered, 3.5 hours to go." Skylar gave a sad smile. "That's longer than a physics exam." 3 hours before landing. The cabin was bathed in a dim glow. Most passengers had their headphones on or were drifting off to sleep. A quiet weariness filled the air, except in row 17. Elijah tried to make himself as small and still as possible. After the earlier confrontation, he decided to focus solely on his presentation slides, letting Thomas's passive-aggressive mutters float past like wind. But even silence, apparently, was provocation. Thomas, maybe bitter from being denied more bourbon, maybe threatened by Skylar's courage, or maybe just unable to tolerate Elijah's very existence, began muttering louder. "Middle seat, yet hogs all the space. Can't even manage basic courtesy." Elijah shifted slightly, giving more room. "I'm sorry." he said, like he had 100 times before in his life. An apology not for being wrong, but to avoid becoming a problem. But Thomas didn't stop. Of course, thinks he's special because of his skin, a couple of honor roll ribbons, and suddenly he's above everyone else. Skylar turned toward him, her voice sharp as a blade. "Sir, I suggest you stop." Thomas leaned across Elijah, eyes locked on hers. "I'm speaking to him. Maybe you should learn not to interrupt grown folks' conversations." The low hum of the engines beneath them suddenly felt louder. Passengers began to turn their heads. And then, because Elijah reached for his phone to check the time and accidentally brushed his elbow against Thomas's coffee, the cup tipped. A few drops spilled onto Thomas's pants. Not much, but enough. Thomas leapt up, face flushed, voice booming. "You people, always causing trouble. I warned you, learn your place." And then his hand flew and struck Elijah across the face. A sharp slap echoed through the cabin like a whip cracking the silence. Time froze. Skylar screamed. "What is wrong with you?" Elijah sat motionless, eyes wide. His left cheek was burning red. Tears welled up, not from pain but humiliation. He hadn't cried in front of anyone in 3 years. But this slap, it wasn't about physical pain, it was a blow to his dignity. And in that moment, the cabin moved. Headphones came off, necks turned. A middle-aged woman shouted, "What just happened? Did he hit that boy?" A young man pulled out his phone to record, and from row 24, Daniel Kovacs stood up. He didn't yell, he didn't rush. He simply walked step by step down the aisle, as if carrying the weight of an entire lifetime with him. A flight attendant hurried toward him. "Sir, please return to your seat, the aircraft is..." Daniel interrupted, voice calm and firm. "I can't. Not this time." He stopped in front of row 17, stared directly at Thomas. "You just assaulted a child," Thomas, still seething, barked back. "He spilled coffee on me. He provoked me. He needs to learn respect." Daniel shook his head slowly, eyes cold. "No, you need to learn self-control. The kind you just threw out the window mid-flight in front of 200 witnesses and half a dozen cameras." The second silence fell over the cabin. But this time, it wasn't silence of fear. It was judgment. Eyes turned. Phones recorded. No one was looking away anymore. Another flight attendant rushed to the cockpit. The lead crew member appeared. A passenger from row 20 yelled, "I saw it all. He hit that kid." A white woman added, "And he was saying very racist things before that." This was the breaking point. The mask of civility had fallen. No more personal views, no more differences in opinion. This was violence, public, documented, unforgivable. Skylar, seated beside Elijah, reached for his hand. "Elijah, look at me. Breathe. You did nothing wrong." Elijah nodded. His chest heaved. But something in his eyes had shifted. Gone was the timid, diligent student avoiding conflict. In his place was someone who had just crossed the final threshold of tolerance. Daniel spoke again, his voice steady but powerful. "I've stayed silent before, in another place, in another time, and I've paid for it. 40 years of guilt. Today I will not be silent." The lead attendant approached. "We've contacted airport police. This man will be removed upon landing. For now, we ask everyone to remain calm for the safety of all passengers." A nearby passenger, the one filming, lifted his phone. "I got the whole thing. The slap, the words, everything. He can't deny it." Thomas, now pale, avoided all eye contact. He wasn't shouting anymore. The anger had turned into something far more telling. The fear of being exposed. No blood was spilled, but honor was. And at 16, dignity isn't something you patch up easily. The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Phones stayed up. A 17-second video hit social media. Within 10 minutes, it had over 100,000 views. The title read, "White Man Slaps Black Teen on Delta Flight, Passengers and Veteran Intervene." Elijah didn't know that yet, but he could feel it. The world had shifted. That slap was no longer just his burden. It had been seen, shared, and this time, defended. Skylar still held his hand, firmly now, refusing to let go. Flight attendant Amara stood right beside his seat, her expression resolute, like a barrier between him and the rest of the world. And behind them, Michael stood silently. But his quiet nod said it all. "You are not alone." When the plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport, the intercom came to life with a voice as calm as it was tense. "Passenger Thomas Whitmore will be escorted off the aircraft first, per request from airport security." A slow clap started from row 12, hesitant, uncertain. Then it spread. Not applause for a safe landing, but an act of agreement, of solidarity, of collective judgment. That behavior is not acceptable. Thomas exited, flanked by 2 security officers. Gone was the smug air, the biting remarks. All that remained was a man, trembling beneath the weight of judgment, and dozens of phones live-streaming his shame. In the terminal, Elijah, Skylar, and Michael were held for statements, each in a separate room. A black officer, probably in his early 40s, entered Elijah's room with the softness of a father. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You have every right to press charges for assault, and since you're a minor, the legal consequences for him would be severe." Elijah sat upright, trying to steady himself. But his hand still trembled, his cheek still burned, not just from the slap, but from a familiar fear. What if no one had filmed it? What if there were no witnesses? Would I have been the one blamed? "I need to think about it," Elijah said quietly. "I want to talk to my dad." The officer nodded. "You have 24 hours to decide. But whatever you choose, know this. Today you did the right thing." Skylar was on the phone with her mom, voice shaking with fury. He slapped Elijah, right there on the plane. And you know what? Elijah didn't even fight back. Not a word, he just took it. I thought my heart was going to break. On the far bench, Michael sat alone, staring at his old flip phone. Inside it was a worn photo of him and a young black soldier, James Henderson, his best friend from the Vietnam War. The man who once saved his life in a firefight. The man he hadn't defended years later when James was falsely accused of disloyalty because of the color of his skin. "I stayed quiet then," Michael whispered to himself. "This time, I stood up." 1 hour later, Elijah stepped out of the interview room, a copy of his statement in hand. His eyes looked steadier. Skylar rushed to him, wrapping him in a hug. "Are you okay?" He nodded. "Okay, I'm just not sure if I should press charges." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can forgive, but don't forget, forgiveness is a choice of the strong. But justice is a responsibility we all share." Elijah looked at him. "Why did you stand up? You didn't know me. I didn't think anyone would." Michael met his gaze, somber, steady. "Because 45 years ago, someone stood up for me, and I didn't do the same for him when it mattered. I've carried that silence ever since. No one else should have to." 4 a.m. in a hotel near Stanford University, where the National Science Decathlon Finals would be held. Elijah woke not from nerves, but from the avalanche of messages lighting up his phone screen. "Elijah, was that really you? You were slapped? I'm a reporter with ABC News. Can we talk? 16-year-old hero, your video is everywhere." He opened TikTok. The clip of the slap had hit 8 million views. Comments poured in from around the world. "I'm a black mother in New Jersey. I cried watching you not react with anger. Elijah, you did what millions dream of. You protected your dignity in the face of violence. In Brazil, we have our own Caldwells. Thank you for not staying silent." Elijah sat up in bed. He didn't know when the tears came, maybe from emotion, maybe from pressure. But one thing was certain. He was no longer just a nameless teenager. At 8 a.m. in the decathlon organizing office, Karen Wallace, the competition director, a poised white woman in her 50s, invited Elijah in privately. "Bookmark. We're aware of what happened on your flight. And let me say this, no one should ever have to experience that, especially not when representing your school, your state." She paused. "Elijah, if you need to withdraw from the competition to rest, we will understand completely." Elijah stayed silent for a long moment. Then he looked up. "Miss Wallace, I didn't come here to withdraw. I came here to win." Her expression shifted from sympathy to admiration. Meanwhile, 10 kilometers away at the newsroom of SF Bay Today, a team of journalists sat in front of a screen watching the replay of the infamous slap. They saw everything that made a powerful story. A 16-year-old black boy slapped without provocation, a wealthy white passenger, an old war veteran stepping in, and a cabin full of silence broken by one person who chose to stand. The lead producer, an Asian American woman named Michelle Tran, made the call. "We're not just telling a story about a slap. We're telling a story about what happens when the younger generation stands with dignity and the older generation dares to make things right." She greenlit a special segment with the title, "The Boy Named Elijah," and the slap that stirred America's conscience. That afternoon, Elijah walked out of the competition room after presenting his project on gravitational waves from binary black hole collisions. The judges stood and applauded, not out of pity, but because he had done what few students could: deliver college-level astrophysics with poise just 24 hours after being assaulted. As he packed up his materials, Skylar ran in breathless. "Have you seen it? Michelle Tran wants to interview you right now. Live stream. National coverage." Elijah hesitated. "I'm not sure. I don't want to be turned into some victim symbol." Skylar squeezed his hand. "You're not a symbol of pain. You're proof of strength. If you don't tell the real story, others will tell it their way." Elijah nodded. "All right, but I'll tell the story of the whole cabin. About Michael, about Skylar, about those who refused to stay silent." At 2:30 p.m., the interview aired. Across the country, Elijah appeared on screen, not as a victim, but as a storyteller. "Yes, I was slapped, but that's not what I remember most about the flight. What I remember is that a stranger stood up, that a girl sitting beside me never left, and that a cabin shifted from silence to standing on the side of what's right." This isn't just a story about discrimination. It's about how we respond to it, not with fists, but with dignity. Viewers across America were brought to tears, not just out of sympathy, but because they were awakened. As the golden light of afternoon fell across the San Francisco campus, Elijah sat outside the astrophysics building, about to head back to the hotel when his phone rang. An unknown number. He paused, then picked up. A deep, slightly uncertain voice spoke. "Elijah? Is that you? This is Michael Kavich. I'm old now, but I still remember how to invite a young man to dinner. Could I buy you a meal, and maybe tell you a story I've kept silent for 45 years? Elijah smiled gently. "I'll come, as long as there's a cheeseburger involved." At 7 p.m., inside a small diner in San Francisco's Mission District, Elijah arrived first. When Michael walked in, he carried a weathered envelope, its edges worn with time. They sat down and ordered simple food. After a few polite exchanges, Michael placed the envelope on the table. "You know, that day on the plane when I stood up, it wasn't just for you. It was for a promise I failed to keep for 45 years. Slowly, he pulled out a black and white photo. In it, two young soldiers, one white, one black, stood shoulder to shoulder in the jungle, both smiling, but with the guarded eyes of survivors. Michael pointed to the black soldier. "James Henderson. He saved my life in Central Vietnam in 1975, and that man was your grandfather." Elijah froze. You're serious?" Michael nodded. "After he pulled me out of an ambush, James asked me to keep it a secret, because back then he was a volunteer soldier, but being black meant he was under constant scrutiny. If word got out that he'd saved a white soldier's life, he could have been punished for acting beyond his orders. And you know the most terrible part? I kept that promise, to the point that I never reached out again, never even said thank you." Elijah looked down at the photo, his hand trembling. "My mom once said Grandpa James never talked much about the war. All we knew was he died of cancer in 2009, taking so many untold stories with him." Michael let out a long sigh. "I've got cancer too. End stage. And when I got the call, all I could think about was James, and the promise I never kept to find his family. On that plane, when I saw you being hit, I didn't just see a black kid being humiliated. I saw James, the man who once shielded me with his own body." Emotion broke through. Elijah's eyes welled up. "So, this wasn't random. A passenger, a slap, someone standing up, not just to protect me, but to make peace with the past." Michael nodded again, eyes brimming. "Maybe James never blamed me, but I could never forgive myself. Standing up that day was the first time in 45 years I chose right." They sat in heavy silence. Elijah finally said, "He saved you from war. You saved me from silence. I think he'd be proud." Michael placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Thank you for giving me a second chance, not to be forgiven, but to finally speak the truth." The next morning, Elijah woke in the stillness of his hotel room, sunlight streaming through the curtain. The national competition awaited him at UCLA's Science Center, but his phone buzzed with a message from Michael Kavich. "Before you walk into the hall, open the envelope in your backpack. I slipped it in last night while you were asleep in the car. Sorry I couldn't say goodbye in person, but it's time I do something else. Something that feels like a real goodbye." Elijah froze. He opened the envelope. Inside were two things. 1. A handwritten letter. I met with a lawyer, left my testimony, along with the video shot by another passenger that day. If you decide to press charges, know that I'm your first witness. If you choose not to, I'll still understand. But more important than that, you need to live, to learn, and to keep using your voice. Don't let one slap knock a star off course. 2. A small silver pin, an old U.S. Army Corps of Engineers emblem. On the back it read, "For James, for Elijah. One day, justice finds its way." At 8:45 a.m., Elijah walked into the auditorium. Cameras rolled, judges waited, students from across the nation were seated. But all eyes were on Elijah. Not just because he was the top finalist, but because the story had shaken social media for the past 12 hours. On the big screen above the stage, hashtags streamed across. Flight 742, Justice for Elijah, we stand with him. Elijah stepped up to the mic, adjusted his notes, then looked straight into the camera. I asked to speak not only as a finalist, but as a citizen. Yesterday, I was slapped in the middle of a flight. Not just because I brushed up against a man, but because I am a black boy. But I'm not here to complain. I'm here to say, I will not stay silent. Not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been told to keep quiet. The room fell silent. Judges set their pens down. One professor blinked away tears. Elijah continued, I've decided I will file charges, not because I need to win, but because we need to reset the most basic principle. No one has the right to lay hands on another human being, especially not because of race. And if I, a 16-year-old kid, can do that, then so can you. One moment of stillness, then the auditorium erupted in applause. Social media exploded, national television replayed every word. And the name Elijah Bennett became a new symbol of courage and untouchable dignity. A month later, in a small cemetery in Santa Barbara, Elijah, dressed in a white shirt, placed a framed photo of him and Michael by a headstone. It read, Michael Cavich, 1958 to 2025, a carpenter, a friend, a man who kept his word. Elijah whispered, I did what you asked, and I'll keep going. They weren't blood, not the same generation, but Michael and Elijah had met. At the moment, a single slap shook the conscience of a nation. And from that moment on, both chose not to stay silent. They chose justice, chose to stand up, and made the world look at itself again. Because sometimes the people who change history aren't presidents or scientists. Sometimes it's an old man who carried a 45-year-old promise, and a teenager brave enough to walk onto a stage with a story too important to forget. If you've stayed with us till the end, thank you. Elijah's story isn't just about a flight, or a slap, or a moment of insult. It's about what it means to stand up, when the whole cabin is silent, when the world looks away, and only one stranger dares to rise from his seat. You see, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they sit 7 rows back, carrying the weight of history and a single decision that redefines everything. If you believe justice needs a voice, if you believe we must never stay silent in the face of injustice, like, share, and subscribe to Aiva Stories. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we tell the truths that need to be heard. See you in the next episode, where another encounter, another journey, will keep you watching till the very end.